Senate Republicans pressed Attorney General Merrick Garland on Capitol Hill today for an update on where the federal investigation involving Hunter stands. It began in 2018 and centers on foreign lobbying and money laundering rules, as well as possible criminal violations of tax laws. It's unclear whether the probe is focused solely on Hunter or if others are involved. President Biden pledged that his Justice Department will act independently, and Garland assured senators there won't be any interference from the DOJ into this investigation that's being overseen by a Trump appointee.
I'm not at liberty to talk about internal Justice Department deliberations, but he is in charge of that investigation. There will not be interference of any political or improper kind.
Well, Garland's answer does not settle concerns for Republicans who are calling for a special counsel.
He's not going to answer any questions, just like President Biden's not asking any questions, which is why we need the U.S. attorney to complete his investigation and make it all public. My concern, Harris, is that they'll end up doing some deal, some plea agreement, which part of that will be to seal the records.
One of Eric Schwerin's visits was with Biden in the West Wing in 2010. At the time, Schwerin was still president of the firm that he ran with Hunter. Other visits involved Steve Ricchetti, who is now counselor to President Biden. Shannon.
Oh, it's me, Jackie. I'll take it from there. No, Jackie, thank you very much. All very, very interesting details. Thank you, John.
Jackie's getting a little ahead of herself there, like 10 hours ahead of herself. Let's bring in Andy McCarthy, former U.S. attorney and a Fox News contributor. Andy. So, Andy, I don't know if it would count as a smoking gun or a smoke bomb shell, but there's this email dated January 17, 2019, from Hunter Biden's then personal assistant, Katie Dodge, to an accountant suggesting that Joe Biden was going to pick up a pretty big bill on behalf of his son's dealings, in part with the Chinese firm, saying, "Hello, VP team. I spoke with Hunter today regarding his bills. It is my understanding that Hunt's dad will cover these bills in the short term as Hunter transitions in his career." You sort of have to set aside incredulity here to think that Joe Biden's going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in bills for his son and not ask what the money's for.
Yeah, well, that's right, John. I think what we're seeing is the paper trail now is, and this is inevitable, catching up with common sense and what we've all known all along, which is that these foreign actors in countries, some of which have very corrupt regimes, some of which are hostile authoritarian regimes, hostile to the United States, they were not paying Hunter Biden for his business acumen. And this isn't even a leap of logic we have to make. We can prove some of that out of Hunter's own mouth. So while Jackie's quite correct that the Justice Department is saying that Hunter may be the sole subject of the investigation now, to say that President Biden isn't involved or that other members of the Biden family aren't involved is preposterous. They're obviously involved because the reason they were making these foreign actors are making the payments is because they want access to Joe Biden and his political influence.
So at what point do you say this is undeniable and this is indisputable on the part of the White House to say that President Biden had nothing to do with his son's business dealings and never spoke to him about it?
Well, I think the way you get to that, Sandra, is to say when they say there won't be any political interference in the investigation, there is already significant political interference in the investigation. And the reason I say that is the Justice Department is bound by a clear regulation, the special counsel regulation, that clearly says if there is a matter in which the Department of Justice is conflicted and it's in the public interest, the Attorney General is supposed to appoint a special counsel. So Attorney General Garland is trying to make it about his personal integrity. He looks at you indignantly and says, don't you trust me to do this without political interference? The purpose of the regulation is to take that out of his hands. If there's an investigation, like you have the Biden Justice Department having to investigate the Biden family, that creates an obvious conflict of interest, and you have a public interest situation, as you do whenever somebody who has national security responsibilities is getting foreign streams of revenue, then that's a clear case for a special counsel. Yeah. So if he's not appointing one, you already have political interference because they're not following the law.
Andy, I want to put up this scroll on the screen because it is pretty incredible when you look at it. This is a detail of most, if not all, of the 27 meetings that Eric Schwerin, who was Hunter Biden's business partner, had at the White House between 2008 and 2016. 8 of those meetings were in the year 2016 alone. There you see one of them, 2/29/2016. Steve Ricchetti, who is the president's then chief of staff, is now his counsel. He also met with Joe Biden in 2010 when Joe Biden was the vice president. So when Joe Biden consistently says, including to our Peter Doocy, I know nothing about my son's overseas business dealings, I've never spoken with him about it. I mean, maybe he didn't speak with Hunter about it, but did he speak with Schwerin about it? I mean, really, you have to suspend disbelief to buy all of this.
Yeah, I think it's worse than that, John, because there's nothing illegal about speaking to him about it. So why deny it unless there's really something that they're worried about?
Well,
and
politically, it looks bad, right?
Well, yes, politically it looks bad, but I would just point out to people, if you were the lowest level, if you were an American who was seeking the lowest level national security job in the government, you would have to fill out an extensive form called the Standard Form 86, where you have to list every foreign contact you have, every foreign visit, every foreign association, every foreign transaction, not only yours, your close family members, because the presumption of our government is that the way people get compromised who are working in the realm of national security is that either they or their family members are involved in foreign transactions and foreign streams of financing and money. And when we're talking about governments that are corrupt or governments that have hostile relations with the United States, that's something that raises the hackles of the people who do these investigations even more.
Because what if he received payout from it, Andy? I mean, the question has always been, what did he know and when did he know it? But now we add to that, what if he got paid out from it?
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's not a question just of crime. It's a question of influence. Biden has the most important national security responsibilities in the government. We are entitled to know what these foreign actors who poured millions of dollars into the Biden family believed that they were buying.
When you put it that way, there's a lot more questions to be answered here, and we wonder if we'll get them. Great to have you here today, Andy McCarthy. Thank you very much.
Good to talk to you. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, John.